Yeah, I think so. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome. I was expecting like 4 people, so I'm glad to see everyone here. This is awesome. Okay, so today we're talking about being called to full-time or part-time ministry or something where you get paid to do ministry. That's kind of a pipe dream for a lot of people, and it's a realistic thing for a lot of people, which is cool. So if you're like, I know God's calling me into ministry and it could be something like this, then great, you're in the right place. If you're like, I don't know where to go, then Rashad's is better, and you're not going to hurt my feelings for going and listening to that. But if you have an idea of what God is already leading you to and like that ministry might be in your future, whether that's in the church or a parachurch organization or something in between or just something that has the gospel under it, I think this is kind of what we're talking about and where to start. So I want to talk first off and define what this actually means when we talk about like getting paid to do ministry. I think we have this view in the U.S. of like being paid to do ministry means you're a pastor of a church or you are at a nonprofit or you start up something, and like really what it comes down to is like there are so many different ways to do this, and I want to kind of open up our minds for a minute about like what this could look like. So I just want to define a few different things, and then we'll talk about why you would go into vocational ministry and then kind of help you figure out where to start. So first off, when we say vocational ministry just means anything you get paid for. So vocational just means you're getting paid, essentially. But there's so many like subcategories of what that means. So the first thing would be full-time. Full-time ministry is what we think of when we think of vocational ministry for the first part, like pastors. You know, we think of people that are full-time in the church. Really, most people who are in full-time ministry means that they're full-time hours and part-time pay. That's just kind of what it is. So, like, I say that semi-jokingly, but also semi just like, if you say yes to this, you're literally signing up for that for the rest of your life, which is fantastic and is worth it. And my wife and I have so many really incredible stories of ways that God has shown up, but it's kind of because we've had to have him show up because of what we said yes to. You know, like there are very few pastors who get paid really, really well. I'd say there are even fewer nonprofit leaders that get paid really, really well. And like regardless of where you land in there, you're not getting paid really well. Like that's just going to be the reality of it. And then we've got part-time vocational ministry, which sounds like it's just full-time but less hours. But there's actually a bunch of different ways that breaks down. So bivocational ministry means that you have a ministry that you do that's part of your income and a job that you do outside of that, a secular job that's part of your income. But the idea behind bivocational ministry is that you would try to get the ministry to give you enough money to eventually be full-time. There are not many bivocational people who are like, this is the plan. And if they do say that, they're probably wrong on the phrasing. The other one is co-vocational ministry, and I'll get to that in a second. The bivocational ministry is usually like a church planter or like a pastor in a rural setting where there just isn't enough people or there isn't enough income to have a full-time job, or pretty much any nonprofit, pretty much any like standalone ministry or parachurch organization. Like the likelihood of you going to full-time right off the bat is basically zero, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But then there's co-vocational ministry, and co-vocational ministry means the plan is to have a job and to have a ministry. And really, co-vocational ministry, I feel like gets overlooked a lot. The goal for Living Faith is that our location pastors at all of our locations are all co-vocational ministers. Because it's not just like we don't have enough money for it. Like that's part of it. That's a good part of it. But a lot of it too is just like with Cody in Irvington, we want him to have the respect of the community who, if he's a full-time pastor, are going to be like, you don't even know what work is. You work on Sundays, you know? We know that's not true. Like a pastor, if you're close to a pastor at all, you realize that they kill themselves all the time doing a ton of stuff. It's a lot of work. But you instantly gain respect just having a normal job. You also gain face time. You know, like Cody is doing substitute teaching, and he's going to meet just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who are potential people that can hear the gospel or people that can be brought into church. So co-vocational, in a lot of ways, I think is actually better than being full-time, depending on what God's calling you to. But then we also have another one that I'm going to add in, that's vocation as ministry. Now, if you are listening closely, then you're probably just like, well, that's a Christian. Like anyone who's a Christian should have a job that is also a ministry, right? But there's a difference between having a job and being like, I want to reach the people here, and having a mission and saying, what job can I get to get into that place? So a lot of times we see this in international missions in particular. Autumn and I are loosely connected to a woman who lives in eastern China, and she runs a business that takes her pretty often into North Korea. And the whole business was set up to do ministry in North Korea. And she does 99% of her work making this business work for the 1% of getting to share the gospel and risk her life to do it, which is powerful. Like, it's really cool that she's willing to put in all that just to reach the one. I've known pastors who have quit being pastors and have instead gone in to be warden in a jail, to reach people who are behind locked doors, literally, that just you couldn't reach otherwise. So many powerful things you can do when you go into vocation as ministry. I also want to say that's not a new thing. Basically, everyone in the New Testament, that was what they did. Not many of them were really paid for or were given money by the church even. And we see Paul specifically call out churches that gave him money as they supported me. It's crazy, that wasn't the norm. The norm was build a tent. And he was a tent maker for most of that time that he was doing that ministry. And really, technically, the vocation as ministry thing is not a vocational ministry, but I think it kind of counts. We see God really do some incredible stuff through that. So I think most of the time, like I said earlier, when we hear about vocational ministry, we think about the full-time pastor position. That's most of what we think. But there is so much else that needs to happen. Just think about how much we're cutting out the knees of the church if we looked at a church and was like, that one person's paid and everyone else shows up. We're literally just taking the power out of the sails of the church. Because no one, it's impossible for all of us to be pastors. First off, half of us don't match at least one of the clarifications for it. And then a whole bunch of us don't for other reasons. And you end up whittling it down to okay, these people can do ministry, which is so dumb. That's just not what we see in Scripture. So if we're looking at every person in the church being a powerful tool for the gospel, there's going to be a whole bunch of different ways to see that come to fruition that are not just a pastor of a church, right? So I think the problem, though, is that when most people try to get into vocational ministry, they think, how do I get enough money to do ministry? And I think we really need to look at it the other way of how much ministry is so much ministry that I can't do it without getting money. It should be backwards. Let me say that again because I know it's kind of confusing. I think we should look at the things that God's called us to do, and we should do them to the best of our ability with everything we have, give it in our entire lives, and we eventually get to a point where we're like, I cannot sustain this. I need to back up of something, and it's not the ministry. And when you back up of your normal job and then fill it in with ministry, that's where it's healthy. And I've seen so many people, specifically pastors, that spend so much of their time raising support and so much of their time trying to do capital campaigns and trying to get more money in and trying to call people that haven't come in a while and get them to start tithing. They're not actually doing ministry. And I've seen so many nonprofits and so many parachurch organizations where you spend 75% of your time just raising support in order to be able to do what you're called to do, which is honestly a part of the reason that I love that we're connected with the Southern Baptist Convention as a church, because of the cooperative program. So way back in the day, I don't even, John, do you know how long ago? It was 180 years or something ago, right? Long time ago. Somebody had it's in our membership book at Living Faith, so if you go through that, it's in there. I think maybe it was like 1905, something like that. So,
In the early 20th century.
okay, yeah. So it was 130 years or so. Somebody along the way was really smart, and they were looking at missionaries, and there were missionaries at that time. There was a lot happening in China, and a lot happening in India, and these people were spending a year doing ministry, and then they'd have to get on a ship to come back to America, and they would spend a horrible amount of time on this ship getting sick and going through all the issues and then coming home and then getting in like wagons and traveling around the US trying to raise support and telling about the mission. Which, can you imagine doing that without video? Can you imagine doing that without photos? like or having like a single black and white picture being like, help us support this guy, you know? Like, it's not like we're sending out a thing for the Lottie Moon offering. Like, this was a harder thing. And they're going around trying to raise money and talking to everybody and saying, hey, this is what God's doing. Don't you want to give to it? And they ended up spending at least half of their time raising money to do the thing that they were doing. And somebody was really smart and was like, well, why don't we just raise the money for you and just send it to you? And that completely revolutionized missions, honestly. And now it's the largest mission sending force in the world, which is incredible. The International Mission Board, we've got like 4,000 people that we support overseas who just do the work and we raise money for them. But most people are not in that boat. Most missionaries still have to raise support, and they spend half the time just raising support. So I would submit to you that if you're seriously praying about going into vocational ministry, the question doesn't need to be, how do I get enough money to be full-time? It should be, how much ministry can I pull off with the time I have now? And if I need more, how do I buy that time? How do I get that time back? And we see that in Scripture, I think, too. Well, actually, I'll tell you my story first. I'm trying to get through a whole bunch of info, so I need to breathe, too. But so when my wife and I started Living Faith, we started as a college ministry that God kind of tricked us into leading. We had no intention of any of this, but we were just obedient to what God said to do. And when we started, I worked for the State Convention of Baptists, and I did graphic and web design stuff. And I was 100% paid by SCBI, not much, but I was paid there. And I was doing everything church completely volunteer. We were working 35, 40 hours at SCBI, something like that. And I was working probably 40 to 45 hours at the church. We had no family, like it was literally just Autumn and I, and then we had in-laws that lived here, my wife's parents, and we hung out with them from time to time, but like we just did ministry. That was all we did. And at the time we could financially sustain it, and we could sustain it with time. Now there's no way. like that would be absolutely impossible. My kids are insane. I have to deal with them. But we started this church and gave all of the time we could until we got to the point where we're like, we are stuck where we are as a church if I don't get more time. Like, I just had to have it. And I tried to go part-time, and my boss was okay with it. He's like, yeah, we can go part-time. But luckily, we actually had a mission partner who came alongside of us and was like, hey, I want to support you. I want to help, but not part-time. I want to see you go full-time. And they paid for the first 2 years of me going full-time, which was huge, and it changed everything. But I think the thing here is, I spent so much time doing the ministry, God supplied the money. I could have spent that same time trying to supply the money and completely miss the ministry, the ministry was the important part here. So we kind of went through this whole thing for a while, and as the ministry got too big, God supplied the money, and we ended up stepping in more time and hoped eventually that Autumn would go full-time that way too, and that never happened. 10 years in now, she's still doing the half-half thing and not getting paid by the church at all. But we see a precedence for this in the Bible, which is the most important thing. In Luke 10, we see Jesus send out 72 people. And he takes these people who we know basically nothing about, except they went out and they prepared the way for Jesus. It was this necessary thing that had to happen. And what he tells them to do is really interesting. Luke 10, 2-4 says this. It says, he told them, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Go, I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves. And then he says, do not take a purse or bag or sandals, and don't greet anyone on the road. So he's like, focus on the ministry, focus on the mission. The mission of this is 2 by 2. I want you to go out and prepare the way for me because Jesus was going to come. And if they get stuck on the road, they're going to miss the mission. But also, I don't know exactly why, and I don't want to like put words in Jesus' mouth, but I would have to assume not taking a purse was a faith thing for them, of stepping out and trusting in God as they went. Like they couldn't bring their life savings with them. It probably also helped them not get robbed on the Roman road and a whole bunch of other great things too. But at the end of the day, they went out and they had to do this mission. And we today look through an American lens at this and we think, oh, they had money. Somebody sent them with money, or somebody would have taken care of them, or the church along was supporting them. But there is no church. You know, like they're literally preparing the way for the beginning of the church being prepared before the church started. Yeah, so I think that I said that right. So they're on this road, they're going, and we have to assume they were working along the way. You know, like everyone took care of themselves. We see in the Bible, Andrew, Peter, James, and John were fishermen. Like they had a job, and Jesus literally came to them like during their 9 to 5. And that's like the first conversation we see. And then Matthew was a tax collector. Everyone hated him, but he showed Jesus in a powerful way. Simon was a zealot, which I think the closest thing you could suggest today would be like a lobbyist. He was trying to, or like a social justice warrior, somewhere in the middle. I don't know. Like he was trying to overthrow Rome. Paul was a political leader who turned into a tent maker. You know, this guy who was probably paid for a pretty high level thing, and then he turned into the dude who makes tents, like basically a contractor. And then Luke was a doctor, and it goes on and on and on, and all these people have all these jobs, and they're doing the jobs, and as they're doing the jobs, they're sharing the gospel, and they're seeing people come to know Jesus. So we can assume that these 72 went out and did their job, but they did it for the mission, you know? Like, and I think there's something powerful about that, of all of us should do what we're gifted to do, or do what we're trained to do, or do what we know, and then in the process, we're starting these things, and we're building nonprofits, and we're going into youth ministry or college ministry. Like, we're doing these things as God sends us. And we get to a point where you like need help, and you can't do this alone. And this is the next part of this verse, Luke 10, 5-7. He said, when you enter a house, first say peace to this house, which go for that too, I guess. But if somebody who promotes peace is there, your peace will rest on them. If not, it'll rest to you, or return to you. But then he says, stay there, eating and drinking whatever they give you, for the worker deserves his wages. Do not move around from house to house. And I think, I don't know that I've ever actually heard this verse used in context. It's always just a worker's worth his wages, you know, and it's like somebody does the work, you pay them. And that's how I've always heard this presented. But I think there's actually a little bit here of Jesus like talking them into taking the help, you know, to saying like it's okay to be in vocational ministry. It's okay as you're going, if you find a person of peace who's like, I want to support what you're doing, it's okay to sit there. It's okay to eat that food. It's okay to be with them. And especially, you know, people like Josh, as you're starting this ministry, you got to say yes to those things. You know, when somebody's like, I want to give you a house, you say, absolutely, fantastic, let's go with it. But I think also we can't ignore the other side as we're doing college ministry or we're doing worship ministry or whatever it is, that we are doing the job until the money is offered. And we can work towards getting money in, but we have to work with what we've got while we have it. And I think there's a lot of nuance here, and everyone's story is going to be different. Like you're not going to have the exact same story as me. And maybe you'll be like, I want to start a ministry, and somebody just pays for it and it's done. Like, don't say no because I have to work for it. Like, do what God gives you to do. But the problem happens when we look at God and we say, you want me to do the mission? Pay for it. I don't want to be that person, you know? Like, if we look at God and say, I will do the mission if you pay for the mission, like, who are we? Like that, we can't do that. Like we can't be that person who is like, if you pay for the thing, I'll take care of it. Like, we need to be people that say, God, you said do it. I will walk to the end of the earth to make it happen, and trust that you're going to help me as I go. Trust that you're going to be giving me resources as I go. So nothing wrong with taking resources, nothing wrong with getting support, nothing wrong with getting help. But there is something wrong with going after that before the mission. I think there's also something wrong with going so hard after the mission that you don't say yes to the help. Like, we need to have both of these things. So I think that's the biggest thing I would say in this is, like, even though we're specifically talking about vocational ministry, don't lose sight of the ministry. Like, don't lose sight of the fact that if God has called you to something big, you just start working on it, you know? And even if that's something that you don't know how to work on, you figure out those steps and you start going, and then God takes care of the thing as you go. And I mean, even a lot of you guys know different parts of my story from hearing sermons and things like that and hearing the story of our church. And I'll tell you, like, when I go and speak at missions conferences, we just were at one in Alabama a week ago, and people just, like, come up to us, like, with their friends, and they're like, tell them the story of how you got the building. Like, all the time. That happened to me 15 times this last week, and I love it. Like, I love just, like, look what God did. It's crazy. I couldn't make this up, you know? But if I had started and been like, how do I get a building? I'm going to make this happen. I would have missed all of that stuff that God wanted to do. I invested in the people, and we invested in what God had called us to in the hardest of hard place, and we had to have the 6 months or 9 months of being under tents, and we had to have the I don't know where we're meeting on Sunday, and we had to have the I'm texting people for the next 8 weeks in a row, different locations, I hope they show up. We had to have all of that in order to get the crazy God dropped this in our lap story. And if we go after the crazy God dropped this in our lap story, all we're going to know how to do is raise money really well. We're not going to know how to do ministry. So that said, in the next session, everyone go next door to Jimmy's breakout on how to raise money, because the dude's incredible at it, and he does the mission and then shares the story so well that people give to it. That is a big part of this that I'm just not hitting on here today. But another part of this too, I think, I want to kind of loop back around to what it looks like to actually give yourself to full-time ministry or to part-time ministry, because when you're not in it, it looks way more glamorous than when you're in it. I think, John, you would probably agree with that. When you look at, like, a pastor, you're like, oh man, I would love to have that. If anyone here, like, has a pull in their heart to be a pastor, like, there's even scripture that says, like, you desire a noble task. But it's like desiring to be punched in the stomach 50 times to take one for Jesus kind of thing. Like, that's what being a pastor is half the time. That's what starting a ministry is. Like, I mean, Matt and I were just talking about that yesterday. Like, there's so many things about ministry that just are hard. And when it comes to getting paid for it, you're just not going to be paid what you're worth, no matter what. And I want to... I went back and forth on whether to share this, not the specifics. Like, I'm going to share how much I make, but I don't care. Everyone can know that. It's not a big deal. But I want to talk about what I do and what it would be in any other world. And it's not to like puff myself up or be like, look at my like job, but I want to give you a realistic view of what I do. Okay. So I make $60,000 a year as the pastor of this church, which after self-employment taxes means I make $45,000 a year, if that. And the majority of the pastors I know make double that. Like, a lot of the pastors in Multiply, Indiana, I actually had one pastor who was like, you make less than our janitor. I was like, cool, thanks, man. That's fantastic. Like, that's okay. But God sent us to a hard place. It just is what it is. But when you look at, like, what I actually do for the size of church that I do it in, essentially, like, I'm the CEO, president of an organization. Like legally, that's what I am. We have a paid staff of 5 people that I oversee, which puts us in the top 0.1% of small businesses in the country. I don't know if you knew that, but 80% of small businesses have 1 or less employees. And 99.9% of businesses in the country are small businesses. So we are a small church, but we're actually pretty big in the grand scheme of a lot of those things. I directly oversee about 20 leaders who run volunteer teams. We directly serve about 150 consistent attenders. We serve a yearly client base, which is, business speak for anyone we connect with. That's somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 in a given year is the amount of people that we connect with and lead. Outside of that, I'm on the board of 3 different organizations, a couple of which I helped start, and one of which I was just invited into. I've mentored somewhere around 30 people that are now doing what I do to some extent, who've started their own organizations or churches, and I get asked to speak all over the country all the time about what God's doing. So, again, please, this is not about me like puffing myself up at all. When I say that out loud, it sounds like a joke because I'm just like Yale. But I'll tell you, if I did that in the business world, I wouldn't be making $60,000. I'd be making at least $150,000, if not $300,000. It could be way more than that, depending on where I was. And being that I'm a church planter at heart and I'm an entrepreneur, I'd probably own the company I worked for if I was not in the church world, and we'd probably be doing something really weird. I don't know, hopefully not what Joel talked about yesterday about deceiving people with fake science, but we'd be doing something from scratch. And right now, I do not make enough money to take care of my family. I just don't. Autumn has to work. And that's just one of those realities, which I know most families now have 2 people that work, but historically, most people have not been in that place. And that's just something I've had to say yes to in that. And if I want to do anything fun ever, if we go on any trip or anything you've seen us post online that's like this big fun thing, I did that through side hustles and either did websites or videos. Which is kind of from my past, and I do it at night when my kids are asleep and cut into my sleep time because we want some money to do stuff that's fun as a family. So all that to say, I know this is like a huge bummer, everything I'm talking about, but seriously, if you want to go into ministry, if you want to go into full-time or part-time ministry, to a certain extent, you're saying yes to this. If you end up moving to England or you go overseas to do what you're doing or whatever it is, I'm calling everyone out, don't do that. If you have something like that you're saying yes to, you are literally every cent you spend, is coming from some little old lady. And it just hurts, it just feels different. Like it lands different when you spend $6 on a cup of coffee. And what you're saying yes to in vocational ministry is that for the rest of your life. But because it's worth it. But because it's for something greater, because it's for eternity, because at the end of the day, you get to look back and say, I didn't do a design scheme for Coca-Cola and I made X number of dollars to sit there after it was done. You're with people in their lives, holding them as they're crying their eyes out and walking through the pain with people. There's nothing else I could think of that's worth it like that. But also it's hard, so you've got to balance those 2 things. And I'll just tell you, it's not for the faint of heart. And you might go into vocational ministry and never get a paycheck. Are you going to turn around and run? That's the question you got to ask. And you might get into vocational ministry and just get hired into a role and you just have a paycheck coming. But if that paycheck goes away, are you going to keep investing in people? That's a conversation or a question you have to keep asking yourself. So it's not for the faint of heart, I'll say that. But the thing I want to get across more than anything, I'll kind of hit back on this, is in vocational ministry, the ministry has to be the goal, not the paycheck, okay? If you get a paycheck, fantastic. You still have to take care of your family. You still have to be responsible. Everything else in Scripture still applies. But the paycheck is secondary to the mission. And if God calls you to the mission and you're willing to say yes to it, that stays first. I looked at, what time do we have until here? Does anyone know? The next one's at 1:20, right?
Yeah, I think the next one's at
1:40?
Yeah, 1:40.
Oh, sweet. Okay. Great. So I looked up a whole bunch of different statistics about new businesses and entrepreneurship, because that's honestly what we're talking about a lot too. Some people might just be given a job that is existing and there is a budget for it, and that's fantastic. If God calls you to that, awesome. That's just not been my experience. But I looked up all these different statistics about entrepreneurship stuff that fails, and I didn't want to bum you out with that much, but it's hard. It's hard information, and knowing the amount of things that just don't get off the ground and the amount of people that start businesses that fall apart. And I was shocked to find out how many businesses are one employee or less, and that one employee is almost never paid full time. Like, looking at the statistics, I think we have this picture of like ministry is I'm doing this job and I'll move to that job, and that's just not realistic. You know, like you start in this job and you might move a little bit over, and you might move a little bit over, and you might move a little bit over, and maybe God just calls you into it. But especially if you're in a place that's lost, it's just, that's not a norm, you know. Maybe in Murfreesboro you'd be fine. You know, you could just find a position somewhere they pay for it. But then also don't forget about the people in China who are struggling, you know, and don't forget about the missions that's going on where there isn't just a big budget to pay for stuff. But yeah, practically, let's get off of the bummer of it, okay? Let's just shake that off, okay? Yeah, because that's all hard. So here's where to start. And this is just a list out of my head that I'm like, if I were to do it again, this is where I would start. Practically, to kind of reiterate it, but I'll go into it further, is start actually doing the work. Don't start by trying to set up the position you're going to have someday. Don't start by trying to build the structure of the staff that you don't have yet. Start by doing the work and be excellent at that work. You know, Josh, if you're loving single moms, the business structure is great. Learning how to build for the future is great. And having a big plan for 10 years is great, but know single moms and love them well as a family. You know, get into their lives, know how to do the ministry, and then you'll know what they need and how to build that structure. And again, so often we're Americans, so we put the cart before the horse. The International Mission Board I talked about earlier is the largest mission sending force on earth. And there's not a chance they would even look at you or interview you if you don't share the gospel in your hometown. You know, like, they're not going to be like, oh, India needs people. And you're like, I'll go. And they're like, oh, you never shared the gospel? You'll learn. You'll figure it out. You know, like, no, like, you need to be doing it. And whatever that ministry is, whatever that thing that's like burdening your heart is, you just start doing it, whether you have a title or not. And I'd be willing to say even most of the time, God's not going to give you a title if you haven't already earned the title. You know, it's kind of like the dress for the job you want, not the job you have. It's like minister for the thing that God's called you to. Don't like go to the thing he's called you to and then start ministering, you know. So I think, if you're doing international missions, like if that's what God's called you to, then find those people in your neighborhood. You know, if he's called you to people from the Middle East, we are surrounded by people from the Middle East. You can say salam alaikum to a whole bunch of people in Speedway, and you can start, I said that the whitest you can ever say it, but so whatever. I know basically like just enough to like share the gospel with them, but if that's what God's burdened you for, which obviously I'm not there, do it, okay? And if he's called you to people that are stuck in trafficking, then speak to people who have been in that and work your way through that. If he's called you to be a pastor, you do not need the title to pastor people. Some of the best pastors on earth have never had the title and will never have the title. Pastor people, love people, take every opportunity to speak that you're given. Give it the best that you have, like study and write sermons like you're going to be given them. I met a guy one time that was like, God called me to plant a church, so I wrote 200 sermons. I think it was 200. And I was like, bro, we are wired differently, but great. Like, that's amazing. Like, prepare for the thing that God's called you to. If he's called you to youth ministry or college ministry or senior adult ministry, like an age group ministry, then spend all your time with those people in a non-creepy way if you're in youth. Like, you got to be careful with youth, but the other ones, just spend all your time with them. Like, if you're called to senior adult ministry and you've never walked into an old folks home, like that's not, you're not doing the ministry. Like, go in and do it. If you're called to be a church administrator, then start serving in every way you can. And when they say, who wants to fold papers, you're the first one to do it. Like, that's a real need in the church. And again, something that we all like look past. If you're serving in a nonprofit or a parachurch organization, then be faithful with the little things in those things. You know, if you have a heart for homeless people, go live on the street for a night. Like, seriously. I did it one time in college, like we did it as a part of a training school thing. And I was like, this is dumb. And we did it, and it changed my life. Like, because you see what people are actually going through. I mean, there's obviously like limits to that. Don't do anything sinful. But like try to get in the shoes of those people and walk with those people where they're at. And God will just break your heart for them even more. Or you'll very quickly figure out that was a fad and that's not actually what you're called to. You know, that's important too. Like you don't want to go all the way down and realize that that's just not what God was calling you for. You just saw a commercial and it tugged on your heart or whatever. So the second thing is figure out your timeline. And this is not like telling God what your timeline is going to be and like telling him, you know, I'm going to do this tomorrow. But I know a lot of you guys in this room feel called to be pastors. You are probably not going to be the senior pastor of a church on Sunday. Like more than likely, you're not getting a call tomorrow or today. Today's Saturday. You're not getting a call today and tomorrow you'll be a pastor. So obviously it's not right now. What's the timeline? And what do you need to work on to get to that timeline? So if this is a 10-year thing, like what does it look like for you to start working today to get to this thing God's called you to? And then I think you need to, the third thing is seek God about how much time to devote to it now. I love what Joel was talking about yesterday. He kept saying the phrase like build the plane in the air, you know, like build the plane as you're flying it. And like I resonate with that so much because I'm not the person that's like, I want to get down and like get all the planning done. That's Autumn. And I'm so blessed that I have Autumn for that. But I'm like, we'll just build it in the air. We'll just go. We'll figure it out along the way. And my prerogative or like the thing I'm going to lean towards is like, if I'm in, I am all in. And I'm going to give every little like breath that I have, like every drop of sweat, it's all going to this one thing. And I think a lot of times that's just not healthy. That's not actually what we're called to do. And we can completely ignore the things that God has called us to or that the things that we're already supposed to be doing in the name of things he's calling us to next. And we can ignore our current calling for our future calling, you know? And this is something that I'm not saying from experience of like I did it right. I did all of that one wrong and always was trying to get to the next thing and ignoring where we're at today. There's also just priorities in your life where I know the pastor thing more, so I'll keep coming back to that, but you guys can apply this to other stuff. But as a pastor, I've seen so many pastors who completely ignore their family in the name of ministry, and that's not okay. The pastors' families are like the most dysfunctional families there are. Like there's always one or two. I don't know. I've seen a bunch of families that all 3 or 4 kids or whatever are walking with Jesus. I've seen some where they're not, and they're amazing men. But I've also seen some in the middle where it's like you have one that's in full-time ministry and one that's in prison, and that's Autumn's family. I don't know if you guys know that or not, but Autumn is in full-time ministry, or more or less, you know. And her brother went to prison, and her son, I'm getting confused. Her oldest brother went to prison and had a really hard background, and her middle brother teaches at a university. So you've got like drastically different things here in one family. And knowing my father-in-law, solid dude, really, really walked with his family well, and sometimes it happens that way. But I've known some that have just completely ignored their family for ministry. I've known some that have completely ignored ministry for family too. Like there's a balance, is what I'm getting at. I could have said that like 5 minutes ago. There's a balance. So as you're getting into the ministry that God's called you to, live in that balance. You know, figure out what that balance needs to be for today. And I think in that, part of figuring out how much time to devote to it is figuring out where you fall on that list of volunteer, bivocational, co-vocational, full-time. More than likely, you're not graduating from one to another. You're like sifting from one to another, you know, like where you're like, I'm 40 hours at my work and 10 hours non-paid here. And eventually it's going to move to 30 and 10 paid. And then eventually it's going to move to 20, you know, in ministry, 10 paid, 10 not. And then you're going to have to adjust those boundaries, and you're going to end up doing something like that. Unless you go for something that already exists and you can just jump into a full-time position that already exists. But a lot of you guys I know are entrepreneurial, like I'm going to start something, and that's just a different thing. The fourth thing is figure out how to fund it. I know I spent a lot of time saying do the ministry and don't figure out how to fund it. Eventually you have to figure out how to fund it. If you know God has called you to 20 hours a week here and 20 hours a week here, or more realistically 40 here, you get paid for 20, and 20 here you get paid for. Eventually you have to figure out where that money is coming from. And so much of that is just learning how to tell the story. So much of that is inviting people into the ministry that you're doing. And again, go to Jimmy Staten's breakout on that, because that dude is incredible at that. And the other person I would say is go to Zach Kester in the third session. He's the one who's a lawyer who is like all about starting nonprofits. He has seen every way it can work and can't work, and he's the kind of guy that will just tell you if it's going to work or not and not care what your response is. So that's a good person to have in your corner. So yeah, I would say, first off, in that, try to make it self-sufficient if possible. If you're starting something from scratch, if you can have money coming in that then goes out. Brad Nally is a great example of this with the Community Care Network. He had a passion for reaching people in communities, in apartment communities, and he was like, how do I raise money for this? And then he was like, well, maybe I can charge the apartment to do it. And now he's in 22 locations and has like 7 more that he could be in tomorrow if he just hires a person for there that he's looking for. And the apartment complex gets retention, and they have more people staying there because the people that live there are happier. And now his ministry is working. Those people get a free apartment and get a budget to spend to do ministry, and it's all just a wash for everybody. That's crazy. Like, that's a God thing. And if he would have gone into it thinking, I need churches in the South to pay for this, like, where would he be? 2 apartments, maybe? I love getting out of the box and thinking that. Raising support is huge. From a church standpoint, there's a lot of churches that love giving to ministries, whether that be a church or like a college ministry or a nonprofit or whatever. Churches love giving to stuff like that. But also people love giving to stuff like that above and beyond their tithe. And what I have found is the people that you would expect to give money don't. And the people that you would never expect to give money, like, just hand it over because they're excited to be a part of something. I learned very early on not to judge any book by its cover when it comes to support raising. Just share the stories widely and be super humble and thankful when somebody gives. Invite people to donate time and energy. I think that's a huge thing. There's a lot of people that might not give any money, but they would gladly give 10 hours a week of administration time, which is a life changer, like, because you could pay somebody to do a job and then be their boss, or you can have somebody work for free and you be their partner. Like, that's better anyway. Eventually you have to hire Kristen and she tells you what to do, but it's perfect. So then the other thing is getting grants. We a lot of times ignore grants, government grants, because not that grant, sorry. You can also get grant. But yeah, so a lot of times we ignore government grants because we're like, that's for non-Christian stuff. But there is nothing wrong with having money that's going to be used for something secular going to using it for the gospel. We don't want to be completely stuck on that where the government can tell us what to do and we could have non-Christians like speaking into our thing, and we can very quickly lose the gospel side of it. One of the partners for Shades in Alabama that we connect with every year while we're down there is an adoption agency. And the guy said something this year that was really interesting. He said they are officially now the largest Christian adoption agency in the country. And he was like, we're the 15th largest adoption agency in the country. But all the other ones did away with the Christian side of things and just started doing the other stuff to appease the government, and we're not moving on it, so now we're the biggest. And that grieved me. I was like, that's crazy. Like, we could have 15 larger adoption agencies that were sharing the gospel if we just stood on the gospel. So I think it's really important to get grants, but make sure you're not bending to the will of it. So then the last thing I'd say is just make goals for increasing the ministry, and the income will follow when there's a need. So don't, again, make goals for the income, make goals for the ministry, and then spend the time as necessary. So simple thing, we actually kind of did it in the main room earlier. I'm going to give you a different way of doing this, but this is a thing that like is a business leadership tool, and it's a thing that like all the Fortune 500 companies do, like in what they teach in leadership development, is to write down like a calling or write down something that you want to do, whether it's start a business or start a nonprofit or whatever. Like what is the thing that we in the Christian world would say calling? And then you write down 10 goals that you want to accomplish in a year. So my thing is be a pastor or whatever, and I want to, the best way to do it is to write it in like present, I've already done it. So I have reached 1,000 people with the gospel, or I have preached to this many people, or I have built this many small groups, or I have whatever those goals are. And then you look at the whole list and you say, if I had a magic wand and I could just have one of those things right now, today, which one would it be? Like what would I give everything to? And then you circle that one thing. You get a new piece of paper, and that's your goal. Your goal is to start 10 life groups or whatever it is. Like if my goal was start 10 life groups, I'd write that at the top. And then I write down everything I would need to get there. And you just start with big things. You get in small things and you reorder them until it's small to big. And then you start working on the first one. It's really simple, but it's really just goal setting. But that changes everything because you have like things that you can do. And then you can start even pitching those to people that want to serve alongside you, or pitching that to people that want to donate and say, you know, I'm trying to start Chosen 1-9 and we want to serve these people, and we're going to start with classes. I mean, you've already done this. We're going to start with classes. We want to have a house. We eventually want to have like a housing center with multiple whatever. Write it all down. And then there's some people that are going to be really excited about the first thing and jump in with you. But there's going to be some people that are really excited about the 10th thing. And then they become a partner for getting you to the 10th thing. And you just kind of work your way through that. So I feel like that's just a whole bunch of random information. But honestly, that's just kind of what I've learned about ministry and starting things from scratch as we go. And the thing I'll leave you with, again, I've said this like 5 times. I really want it to land. Do the ministry. Like if God has called you to a ministry, do that. Don't be dumb about it, but also God will fill in the holes. And he'll get you to where he wants to get you if you're faithful with the little things he gives you. So if you're faithful with little, he'll give you more. It's almost like that's biblical. So I know, it's crazy. Cool. We've got I think 8 minutes before we have to give you time to walk to the next place. So what questions do you guys have? I don't know that I can answer any, but I'll try.
Do you guys go off of grants and stuff like that?
No, but I really want to. So as a church, a Christian nonprofit has way more ability to get grants than a church. And what we've actually talked about doing is what Jimmy next door does, where seriously, go to his breakout. But they have a church, and under the umbrella of the church is a nonprofit that is a Christian nonprofit, but it doesn't have the word church in it. They raise most of their money through that nonprofit. And they've been able to do so many things just because they built it that way. And we're talking about doing that at some point. We've been talking about doing it for a while, but Jimmy like takes it to a different level where they have a food bank, but instead of just giving out food, they made a whole restaurant that I've been in before. It's cool, where like they take your order and they bring you food and show you like that you're a human, you know, and you don't have to like wait in line and get it slopped on a plate. They bring it to you like you're worth something. And they have people that work full time in that kitchen, like just like the restaurant workers who just serve people free food. And then they've got all these houses they've built and bought to be able to have people, single moms come in and live. Like they already do that stuff, and they have foster care stuff, and they've got homeless stuff, and they have all these things. And they're a church of like, I think 70 people. You can ask him, but they have like a $900,000 budget from grants and from donations and from special dinners, and like he just tried everything, and the money just comes in from different people, and they've made connections. So we don't get grants, but we are working on it. So yeah, we get some grants, and they're great, but it's like once a year for a weekend. It's yeah, good question. What other questions you guys have?
How do you get most of your money?
We just pray and it falls from heaven. No. So yeah, our budget is built up. I I will give you every number you want. Like we're super open about money, so you can see every dollar we've ever spent on coffee, or you can see my income, whatever. It's all out there, which most churches don't do, but we felt passionate about from the beginning. I just don't remember. But I want to say our budget right now is $240,000 from inside the church, just people tithing, which, by the way, in our church is insane. We have about 85% of our members tithe regularly. The national average is between 2 and 3%. Yeah. I think we are a church today because God's blessed us for our faithfulness to show up alongside what he's doing. I really do. Like, I don't think we would survive without that. So most of it is from internal, which is crazy in our church. Like, you know who we reach. Like, that's God. But also we have churches that partner with us. And usually churches partner with a church plant for 2 to 5 years. Usually it's 3 years is most churches. And we've been able to just tell really great stories to some of those churches and be like, hey, we are in a place that is never going to sustain itself. Will you help us long term? And we've got a few churches that have decided to help long term. We've got a few, like Shades, is one I talked about a couple times today. Our partnership with them ends at the end of this year because we had 3 years for Near West. We had a bonus year for COVID, and we got 3 years for Irvington. So as we plant our third location, we'll start partnership up again. Hopefully. That's our goal. But yeah, so we just have churches that come alongside of us because they love what God's doing. And then we also have a couple one-off donors who donate specifically to things. So like our clinic is completely covered by one family who just wants to serve in the clinic, and they give, I think, $17,000 a year to cover our side of the clinic and keeping the lights on and that kind of thing. And we've got people that give to special things and give extra at the end of the year and that kind of thing. So it's kind of diversified, but not nearly as diversified as it could be. So, but yeah. What else? Any pastoral specific or mission specific? I think that's a couple things I didn't hit on super heavy.
What if the ministry you're called to start requires like schooling first? Like it's not.
Yeah.
It's harder to just go start doing it now because you don't have the qualifications to do it.
Yeah. I'll give you my personal opinion that a lot of people would not agree with, and I'm totally like fine, like, you know, different strokes. I firmly believe that the training for people should be in the church and not like for the church. There's nothing wrong with seminary. My wife has a seminary degree. She learns that way. She loves it. She wants to go back and get her doctorate just because she's crazy. I don't learn in that area. Like I did really badly in school, but I love studying. Like I love learning. I love always getting new stuff, but school just was terrible for me. So seminary for me, like I've thought about going, and I still am thinking about going. I don't have an undergrad, but for me, after you have 10 years of ministry experience as a lead pastor, they can like write off your undergrad and still give you a master's, which is cool. So there's stuff like that, like Southwestern does that, and I think Southeastern does that, and I think Southern does that. There's a bunch of seminaries that do that. But personally, I'm just like, why? Like I love what Joel said yesterday, that like the people who didn't know Jesus looked at the men who were with him and they said they're untrained, ordinary men, but they've been with Jesus. And if I was the pastor of Hamilton Hills, I would go to seminary. But God has called me to a very different place. And kind of like co-vocational people reach people in the inner city better, I kind of think uneducated people reach people in the city better too. Because I can be like, I'm not any better than you. I have a high school diploma barely. You know, like I'm glad I got up on time for the last month. I wouldn't have made it otherwise, you know. I think that helps me connect with people better. So I think the question is not like, how do I get all the training to do what I'm going to do? The question is, how do I do what I'm going to do, and what training do I need for it?
Yeah.
So if you need training for it, get the training, you know. If God is calling you to do business missions in North Korea, you better get a business degree to be able to do it in China, or they're not going to let you in. You know, like I think it has to be for everybody. Like, where are you serving, and what do you need to do that thing? So, good question. We got time for one more.
Is there anything that really motivates you when you're like really going through it? You know, just like under the stress of ministry that just continues to like get you out of it?
Yeah. I'm going to cry when I say this. I'll tell you right. I'm going to try really hard not to. Like I'm not afraid of crying. I just don't know if I can get through it. You guys know the ministry we do is hard. Like all ministry is hard. Living for the gospel is hard. But when you have your life threatened and your family threatened, and you have people that want to come after you and try to find out where you live, it's hard. And when you have people that go through open demonic oppression and people who are angry at you just because of what you believe. Like when you go through all this stuff, it's just a lot. And for the first probably 6 years of doing ministry, maybe 7 years, I legitimately in my heart quit every 6 months. Like every 6 months I went through this cycle of I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I'm working the bare minimum. I'm going to show up. I'm not just going to leave. I'm going to be responsible, but my heart's not in it anymore and I'm done. And I would go through that and kind of like have a season of rest that was really helpful and really healthy. And then I would get back into it and my heart would be there again and I'd keep going. And then it would happen every 6 months. And I remember one time going through that and I was just praying and like, God, what do I do with this? And I was like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And God just like hit me with this thing that like to this day, like just strikes me. And I'll give you the preface of Autumn and I have had this rule since we got married that we never mention divorce. Like we don't say it jokingly. Like if you were you lived with me. Like I told you that before you lived. I was like, if you say, divorce, I'm going to be like, no, we're not even joking about that in my house because it's serious. And I felt like God said, you're serious about not divorcing your wife. Why aren't you serious about not divorcing my wife? I was like, oh my gosh, like. And when you realize that that's what you're representing, it's a different level of working through it. You know, you can't just pull up your bootstraps and keep going. Like it just doesn't work that way when everything's horrible. But when you realize you're literally giving your life for the bride of Christ and it's worth sacrificing your life for it, like it just keeps you going in a different way. The other thing I'll say with that is that seasons of rest are absolutely necessary. And I would not be where I am without weekly Sabbath, without taking Mondays off. Matt lived with us for a little while, and like it was almost comical. Like all the time, people would like contact Matt to get to me because I do not answer my phone on Mondays. Like if anyone, unless it's my wife or like my direct family, I'm not answering the call. I'm just not doing it because I've realized that if I can serve them the other 6 days, it's worth saying no on one day. You know, and I just needed a day that was me and God or me and like not life-altering decisions, you know. Like I still worked, I still mow the lawn and make videos or have fun, whatever. It's still like hard stuff to do. You got to clean the house, but it's not life or death for that day, and that sustains you. And then every 3 months to 6 months, you need a weekend or you need a season that you would normally be serving where you can pull out and be like, I'm not doing it, you know, and get away and just get with God. And for a long time, I thought that was enough. And then I would start like really crashing every year or two. And then I realized that sabbatical is necessary too, you know, and having a long season where you pull away. And since I took a sabbatical, genuinely, like I've had hard times for sure, but I haven't slipped into that in the last 2 years because I've had the weekly, the quarterly, and the every 5-year thing of like, I'm going to pull away and trust God for this ministry that's not mine, you know. So I think that's the best thing I would say is have healthy habits of rest and constantly remember why you're doing it. One more thing I'll say, which I could talk about this as a whole breakout, honestly, is realize that the weight is not on you. Like the verse of your yoke is easy and your burden is light is real. It never feels light, but being yoked is literally like 2 oxen yoked together to plow a field together. And let's be honest, like if you got yoked in with an oxen, you're not doing much of the work. You're feeling the weight of it. You're still seeing the plow go next to you. It's still heavy, but he's carrying all of it. You're just strapped on. You could lift up your feet and still do what you're doing. You know, like you're still being yoked in it. And it's hard and it's heavy, but we have to realize that the heaviness is not ours to take. And when we take other people's sin on ourselves, we die. And Jesus already died for it. So what's the point of that? And when we take their hardship as like, this is my whole life, like we sacrifice our families in the process. And when somebody keeps rejecting God again and again, and we take it personal, like they're not rejecting us, they're rejecting God. Like, let him take that weight. He's already got it, and he can, So, cool. I think we're out of time. Thank you, guys. If you have any other questions, I'll stick around probably in the hallway for a minute. I'd love to talk one-on-one, or we can talk over the rest of the day. But everyone go to Jimmy's breakout.